In this video, I hope to explain to you a concept that I think is probably the most important strategy in terms of learning difficult material. And this is the idea of pre-notes. Now, over here on the right side of the screen, you can see that I have a blank Word document open where I'm going to take some pre-notes. And over on the left side of the screen, I have the textbook open too. I just chose this particular learning objective out of the textbook because I had to pick something in order to do a demonstration. And this seemed to be a pretty good one to pick. Now, the idea of pre-notes is that I look at the course schedule and I see what we're going to do during the next class. And in my course schedule, in this example, I look at the schedule and I see that, in our next accounting class, we're going to do earnings per share. And that's learning objective 3-4. So before I come to that class, I'm going to take some pre-notes. The vast majority of students do not do this. Most students don't even look at the material. They don't even really know what we're going to cover. They just come to class and show up and try to take notes as they go. Why? Because that's the way they've always done it, and they've had pretty good success doing it that way. But when you're dealing with a difficult class, with complex concepts, advanced material, you have to get out in front of that material if you want to be successful with it. And so the way to get out in front of that material is to do pre-notes. And so this is what I did as a student and what I would encourage you to do as a student. Again, in your difficult classes. Easy classes, I would never do this. But for my difficult classes, yes, I do this. So again, the idea of pre-notes is I know we're going to cover earnings per share in the next class period. Why? Because it's on the class schedule. If I don't have an access to the class schedule, I look in the syllabus, or I simply ask the professor, hey, what are we going to cover in the next class period? Or ask for a class schedule. Hey, what are we going to cover next week? I want to work ahead. I want to read ahead. I can't imagine a professor not providing you that information. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go through this section of the textbook, and I'm going to take some notes. And when I take notes, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get a general idea of what this topic is about. I'm not trying to master it, but I'm trying to get familiarity with it so that when I go to the next class period and the professor starts talking about this concept, I'll already have a general idea of what this concept is about. And I'm likely going to have some questions. And they're going to be pretty intelligent questions, because if I engage with this material ahead of time, I'm probably not going to understand every single thing. And so that's naturally going to lead me to say, okay, I went over this, but I don't really understand this part, whatever that part is. And so I'm just going to make a note of that when I go to the next class to ask about that, to get some clarification from the professor while I'm there in the class. And that's going to help me accelerate my working towards mastery of this concept. So let's get started. So this is going to vary by class and by professor. Obviously, if you have a longer section, this is going to take longer. If you have a shorter section, probably not as long. And the more times you do this, the more efficient you're going to get. So the first time you do it, it's probably going to take a really long time, and you may not do a very good job at it. Once you go to class and realize, wow, I thought I did a good job of taking notes ahead of time, but it didn't really, it kind of sucked. And so I didn't really do as good a job as I thought. But you'll get better. And so persistence here, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. The first thing I would do is rather than just dive in and start taking notes, I just want to glance at the textbook, take 30 seconds and glance at it and kind of see what's going on with this textbook. Now, the first thing I notice up here in the textbook section on the left-hand side of the screen is up at the top, I see this formula box. And formulas are usually pretty important. So I'm probably going to make a note of that right off up front. I'm going to type it into my notes first thing. Earnings per share is equal to net income minus preferred dividends. And then I'm going to divide that, it says, by weighted average common shares outstanding. And I don't like the fact that this is not all on one line, so I'm going to abbreviate here. I'm going to call this like weighted average common shares, and then I'm just going to put OS for outstanding. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get this set so that when I look at the formula, I see it all on one line. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight that because that's a formula. Okay. Now, I may not know what all those terms mean. I may not know what net income is, or preferred dividends, or what common shares outstanding means, or what it means to take a weighted average. And that's okay. I haven't even started reading yet. But it's one of those things that if I don't understand it after the reading, then I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to ask about this during class. I want to make it a point. When the professor goes over the formula, or if he or she doesn't, I'll just interrupt and say, hey, I was looking at the formula, and could you explain what weighted average means in terms of this denominator in this formula? But formulas are pretty important. And so whenever I see one, I'm going to tend to write it down and highlight it. Now, as I go through this, I see, there's some text here, and some things are bolded. I've got some different things. I'm not sure what this is. I'll look at this later. And then I come down here and I see we've got some examples of what I might see in a company's presentation in their financial statements. And so, okay, I can look at that later if I want to. I've got some demo problems. These are probably going to be good to go over later. Again, another demo problem, probably going to be good to go over later to give me some practice. And if I were doing this later, I would probably scroll down like this so that I can't see the solution, and then look at the demo problem and try to work it out on pencil and paper. And that's key. I would never try to work it out in my head, but I would take out a sheet of paper and a pencil, just scratch work, and just try to work this out like this was an exam question, and say, okay, if I had this question here, this is demo LO 3.4, Cabela Corporation down here at the bottom of the screen. If I had that on the exam, could I work that out? And that'd be kind of a test, right? And then when I was done with that, I could look at the solution and then say, okay, did I get that right or not? And then I would go to the next problem and say, okay, let's see, the solution's there. So let me work out this next Cabela question and see if I can get that right. And I can come back and do this multiple times. So I think students make two mistakes with practice problems in the textbook. The first is they ignore them and they don't do them. And that's an error. Okay, don't ignore them. They're there for a reason. In fact, I had a student tell me one time when I was asking about what do you do to be successful in the class, I had a student tell me that he would not move on in the text until he could work basically all of the practice problems that were presented in the textbook, multiple times to the point where he could basically do it from memory. And then when he had that kind of, okay, I've got this basically memorized, okay, now I can move on to the next practice problem or the next section of the textbook. I think the other mistake, I said there was two mistakes. The first mistake is to ignore the problems. I think the second mistake that students make is that they don't actually work it out. So they read the problem, they look at the solution, and they say, oh yeah, I've got that, I understand. If that's you, I'm telling you right now, when you tell yourself, yeah, I got that, I understand it, no, you don't. You are lying to yourself. Stop it. I've heard it said that the biggest lies that we tell in this life are the ones we tell ourselves. And this is a lie. It is very common to see a problem and then look at the solution without working the problem out and say, oh yeah, I understand that. No, you don't. Because the problem is on the exam, you're not going to have the solution to look at. And then you're going to be stuck. And you're going to have the uh-oh moment that I don't understand this. So don't be lazy. Don't lie to yourself. Hide the solution. Get out a sheet of paper and a pencil. Yes, it takes effort. Get out a sheet of paper and a pencil and work it out. I'm not saying do this in the pre-notes. I'm saying, after you go to the class and you come back and you're working practice problems. So just to be clear, I'm doing pre-notes today. Then I would go to class, hear about earnings per share, and then after the class, I would come start working practice problems. And that's where I would get these demo questions out and maybe other problems in the back of the chapter. Maybe I could go to Chat GPT and have it create some problems for me, which I'm sure it could. And then just do some practice problems that way and just keep practicing until I really feel like I've mastered this. So just telling you about practice problems. So right now, today in my pre-notes, I'm not going to pay any attention to these, but I would come back later and work on these quite a bit. So we come down here. Again, this practice problem seems to go on for a while. And then we've got another review problem. So again, we've got another problem here. This one doesn't have the solutions to it, but it does tell you where the solutions are right here. It says it's on page 3-51. So again, it's another one you could work and practice later. And then we've got this little part down here on expanding your knowledge. Expanding your knowledge tends to be going over and above the basics. So I'm going to leave that for right now. And then we're on to the next topic, which is learning objective 3.5. So you can see here that we don't really have a very long section in terms of pre-notes. We've got basically a couple of paragraphs up here, maybe a paragraph on the next page, and then we've got some demo problems, and then we've got a review problem, and then we've got maybe this little section down here. So really not a lot in terms of the pre-notes, but I want to make sure that I go through this and try to at least get some understanding of what's going on. Now, as I start just skimming this, reading this out, I'm going to read out this first little paragraph here. Companies must report earnings per share on the face of the income statement. So I'm going to make a note of that. EPS must be reported on the face of the income statement. Okay. Now, what I'm doing here is I am creating notes in a Word document. And before I get too far down the line on this, when I would do this as a student, sometimes I would just take notes like I'm doing right now. If the chapter was if the section that I was going over was a little longer, I might actually outline it and use like formal Roman numerals and stuff like that if I thought that would help, or I might use bullet points or stuff like that if I thought that would help me. I'm not really doing that now, but what I'm trying to say is I don't do it the same way every time, and I don't think it really matters. It's just what you're comfortable with. But what I'm doing here in the pre-notes, and I want to talk about this for a minute, is that I am writing down what I think is important or what I have questions about. Then what I would do is I would take these pre-notes to class. And then instead of trying to write down everything the professor says, like most people do, they get out their notebook and they get a pencil, or they get out their laptops and they're trying to furiously write down everything the professor says. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to have this pre-note sheet printed out or on my laptop, or if I'm handwriting it, which you can do, I'll have the handwritten piece out in front of me. And all I'm going to be doing here is making edits. So, for instance, I'm writing down earnings per share must be reported on the face of the income statement. Why? Because I can foresee a question on an exam. Where should earnings per share be reported? Right? I mean, I don't know that that's going to be an exam question, probably not, but I can foresee it. So I'm going to write it down. And if the professor in class says, hey, you need to know for the exam where earnings per share is reported, then I'm going to come through and I'm going to bold this in my notes during class, or maybe put a star by it or something like that to remind myself that that's really important to remember. On the other hand, if the professor says, you don't really need to know where earnings per share is reported, I'm not going to test you on that, then I might just strike through that with a line like that so that I just know, okay, that I had that in my notes, but that's not going to be on the exam. Or I might just delete it altogether, okay? But the point here is that I'm using the pre-notes when I go to class. I'm actually going to be editing the pre-notes. If there's something the professor mentions that I don't have in my notes, then I'm just going to go ahead and type it in my pre-notes right then. If I have things in my pre-notes that the professor doesn't have, that doesn't mean I should erase those, because professors may ask me about things on the exam that they're not covering in class. Maybe he forgot to say it or forgot to mention it, because people, make mistakes. They're human. So I don't necessarily want to go the other way with it. But what I'm doing here is I'm looking to use these pre-notes at a future point to really make my note taking much more efficient and much more informative in terms of studying for exams. Now, the second piece down here, it says earnings per share relates the income of the company to a single share of stock. That's just basically the formula. And then I have this weird thing right here, this 260.10.45. Let me see if I can get this a little bigger. This 260.10.45 here. And what this is this is a code copied verbatim from the Accounting Standards Codification. And this is one of those things that if you don't know what it is, you want to ask about it. And the other question you would have is do I need to copy this down? And the first time you do this, you might make a note of it instead of copying it down word for word. I might make a note here and say like, okay, 260-10-45-2. What is this? Do we need to know it for the exam, right? I might make a note like that, and that'll remind me in class that, if I don't want to bring it up during class, I could stop by and see the professor, before or after class, or go by office hours, or maybe send an email, whatever, and say, hey, I was going through the textbook and I noticed this little piece right here. Is this the kind of stuff that I need to memorize for the exam? Now, at this point, we're in chapter 3, and this stuff, for just so you know, this stuff comes up in every learning objective in the book. So by this point in the class as a student, I would already know the answer to this question because it would have come up in chapter 1. But it's the kind of thing that I want to ask about because I'm not really, this is a lot, entities with simple capital structures, that is, those blah, 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 blah. That's a lot to kind of type and memorize. And it's one of those things that's in a different font than like the regular textbook font. So it's kind of, and I see a lot of those, like I see 260-10-45-3. So do I really need to remember the difference between 260-10-45-2 and 260-10-45-3? I don't know. That seems kind of nitpicky to me. Am I going to get asked on an exam which of these is 260-10-45-2? Right? I don't know. I don't know that I need to go to that level of studying. But before I put in that kind of effort, I want to know. So it's one of those things I might ask in class, like, what is that? What do those numbers mean? Do we need to know that stuff for the exam? Do we need to memorize those definitions? And if you're in my class, I'm going to tell you no. That stuff is just wording verbatim out of the codification, and the authors are putting it there. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to show you where this stuff actually is in the accounting standards. If you were to go look it up, this is where you would find it. You don't need to memorize it for the exam. I'm not going to ask you about it, but it's there. What the authors are trying to do is they're trying to connect the professional standards that accountants use to what the authors in the textbook are saying and explaining. And so I can go ahead and safely delete this. I would not delete this in my pre-notes, but after I asked the professor about it and he said, no, you don't need to worry about it, then either in class or after class or whenever, I would just come back in here and edit this. And again, this is an important idea for me. So my pre-notes are not something that I make and then I save to a folder and I never look at until the night before the exam. These are notes that I'm going to be editing as I go, right? The professor, whatever the professor says in class, or maybe during an exam review, the professor might say something else about earnings per share that I might need to highlight in my notes. He says, oh yeah, on a review day, this is going to be on the exam tomorrow for earnings per share. Maybe I hadn't highlighted it in my notes yet. I want to come back and make sure I do that. Okay, so I'm always editing, massaging these notes, so to speak. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get these notes into a position to where as I'm starting to study for the exam, I know I have really solid information to study. It's solid, it's organized, the really important stuff is highlighted. That doesn't mean I ignore everything else. Things that I've asked about and cleared up, I've either deleted or struck through so that I'm not wasting time studying stuff that's not going to be on the exam, and so on and so forth. And so this is really an important document for me as a student. So I'm going to skip over that, and I'm going to go to this computing earnings per share. And here it says earnings per share is computed by dividing reported net income by common stock. So that's basically just the formula. It says for the computation of EPS on common stock, net income must be reduced by any preferred stock dividend claims because here is a very important word when you're reading. Because when you're reading, the word because is telling you why something is the way it is. And as professors in difficult classes, we often like to go beyond basic memorization and get into reasoning and logic and causation because we're trying to test how deeply your understanding of this topic is. It's one thing to know how to drive a car. It's another thing to know how a car works, right? How the car actually works in the engine in order to make the car move. There's a difference between being able to drive a car and being a mechanic. And so this because is kind of getting into the mechanic sort of ideas. This is why things are happening. So net income must be reduced by any preferred stock dividend claims because such dividends are not available to common shareholders. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go up here and move. I'm going to put this reasoning underneath the preferred dividends, and I'm going to put it in italics just to make it stand out to me. You don't have to do that, right? So the reason you subtract preferred dividends is because these dividends are not available to common shareholders. Now, again, you can abbreviate if you want. I don't usually abbreviate when I'm typing because I don't need to. If I was writing this out by hand, I might do some more abbreviating. You just want to be careful when you abbreviate not to over-abbreviate, so when you go back and look at it later, you don't remember what you meant. I use divs all the time, D-I-V-S, for dividends. So I've been doing that for years, so I know what that means, and so that wouldn't bother me. But if you don't know what that means, then just go ahead and type out dividends. Okay. Now, I may not understand this reasoning, right? Like, okay, it says here that I subtract, the reason I subtract preferred dividends in this equation is because these dividends are not available to common shareholders. Okay, I don't really know what that means, right? And so again, if I don't know what that means, I might make a note here. Somewhere about this, ask about this, right? So when I get to class, in the next class period, when the professor is talking about this formula, I can raise my hand. I can say, hey, so, I know that I'm supposed to subtract preferred dividends, but I don't really understand why. And that's a really good question because that's the kind of question that could easily show up on an exam. Okay. Because that's, instead of just memorizing a formula, it's going beyond memorization and it's getting into more of a deeper conceptual understanding of why something is the way it is, instead of just staying on the surface level and saying, oh, it's a net income minus preferred dividends. So I can solve a problem on an exam that asks me to compute earnings per share if I memorize that formula. But if I get a conceptual question about why I subtract the preferred dividends, I'm not going to be able to answer that because I don't really have that deeper level of understanding. In difficult classes, you're always searching for the deeper level of understanding. That's what makes the class difficult, is that you're expected to go beyond surface level memorization and work at these deeper levels. So when I'm going through a text, words like because are really important to me. All right. Demo 3.4 illustrates, so that's just saying there's a practice problem below. Okay, I know that already. Reporting earnings per share. If the income statement includes discontinued operations, per share amounts are reported for. Okay. So I need to make a note about this. This is going to go into reported EPS is done for, and then I'll make a list here. 1, income from continuing operations. 2, income or loss from discontinued operations. 3, gain or loss from on business component. I don't know what that means, but I'm going to have to ask about that one. And 4, net income. So this is curious, right? This is basically saying that per share amounts, in other words, you must report EPS for 4 different things on the income statement. So earnings per share is not going to be just one number, but it's going to be potentially 4 numbers that are computed for the income statement. So this seems to me kind of important to know that I might have to do it 4 different ways. And again, if I don't know what continuing operations means or discontinued operations means or what gain or loss recognized on business component means, those are good questions to ask during class. Okay. The per share amounts for discontinued items can be reported on the face of the income statement or in the notes. So I'm going to come up here and say EPS must be reported on the face of the income statement or in the notes. Okay. So this is kind of confusing to me. And here's why this is confusing to me. Because this right here says the per share amounts for discontinued items can be reported on the face of the income statement or in the notes accompanying the financial statements. But up here at the very top, it says companies must report earnings per share information on the face of the income statement. So this first sentence makes it seem like companies have to report it on the face of the income statement, where this sentence down here makes it seem like they can report it on the face of the income statement or in the notes. So the first sentence makes it seem like you have to do it, and the second sentence makes it seem like you don't have to do it. So this would be something that when I went to class, I would really want to make sure that I ask about. In fact, I'm going to bold these question marks here to make sure that I see them and say, wait a minute. What? That didn't make sense to me. So I'm going to put a question mark down here about or in the notes. And so this is going to be a question that I'm going to be sure to ask the professor during class or after class or whenever it's convenient, during office hours, that sort of thing. Okay. Demo 3.4, there's just a demonstration problem there. So, okay. Again, this is 260, 1045.3. We've already talked about that. Accounting standards require the disclosure of both basic and diluted earnings per share. Okay. However, in Chapter 3, we only consider companies with a simple capital structure where no common stock exists upon potential conversion or exercise that would dilute earnings per share. So what this is saying is that accounting standards require you to report earnings per share both for basic and diluted. But the next sentence says in Chapter 3, they don't consider anything that would be diluted. So that means we're only doing basic earnings per share. So as I read this, this says I don't need to know anything about diluted earnings per share, and that's correct. You don't need to know it. But it's one of those things, if I were reading it and I were unclear, I would make another note down here, basic versus diluted earnings per share, right? Do we need to know this? Again, I would make a note to ask. And when you come to class and you ask me, I'm going to say, no, you don't need to know anything about diluted earnings per share. That's going to be in a later chapter in another class that you'll take later on in your accounting work. And so then you can go ahead and safely delete that. But it's one of those things, if you don't know, make a note of it and ask about it, okay? We've talked about this. This is just how it looks in the company's financial statements. I can go over that later, but it's not going to be part of my pre-notes. Demonstration problem, earnings per share problem, and then expanding your knowledge, non-controlling interest. So expanding your knowledge. Do I need to know about non-controlling interest? Again, this is it's not in the same font as the regular text. It's in a little box by itself, kind of in a little special box. And it's called expanding your knowledge. So this seems to me to kind of be like an extra something. And so the question I would have for the professor is, these extra things in the textbook, do we need to know that? If the professor is talking about it during class, if you're sitting in class and the professor starts going on about non-controlling interest, then that's kind of a sign that you do need to know about it, right? Especially if he's saying things like, non-controlling interest, it's really important. You need to know it for the exam. Then I don't really need to ask about whether I need to know it. I can go ahead and change this and say non-controlling interest. Let's make sure we know this. And then after class, I can come back and go through this paragraph, and because there's just a single paragraph here followed by an example, I can go through this paragraph and kind of take some notes on non-controlling interest. But for my pre-notes, I'm not going to. So what I'm trying to do with my pre-notes is I'm not trying to spend 3 hours to get every single little detail in the textbook into my notes. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture things that are obviously important to me. And obviously is a dangerous word because, is it obvious to everyone? Probably not. But I'm doing my best. So things like formulas, when I see words like because, when I see definitions, when I see things like where there's multiple steps and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, like they were up here in the reported earnings per share paragraph. When I'm seeing things like this, I'm putting those into my pre-notes. I'm putting in questions that I have. Ask about this, things that I'm not sure about. And then when I go to class, all I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this back up on my laptop, or I can print it out on a sheet of paper and just take it into class with me. Or I can handwrite it. If I'm handwriting these notes, I just take those notes in with me. And then as the professor's going through class, I'm just making adjustments to these pre-notes as I go. But the key here, the big key, is that by the time I get to class where the professor is discussing earnings per share, I've already become at least somewhat familiar with this material. I already have exposed myself to some of the definitions, some of the vocabulary, the formula, some of the ideas. And now I'm in a position where I know kind of what I'm already comfortable with to some degree. I know what I need to ask questions about. And I also know to ask about things as to whether I really need to know them or not. And this is going to help me be focused in the next class period. Instead of having a blank sheet of paper open with my pencil, and I've never engaged with this material at all, and the professor is going 100 miles an hour, and I'm just trying to copy down everything he says, and he's using words that I've never seen before, like preferred dividends and continuing operations and discontinued operations and business components and weighted average. And I'm like, I don't even know what this stuff means. And I'm sitting here trying to write it down. That's really difficult. But if I come with my pre-notes to class, I've already engaged with some of these terms. And I could even, if I have time, I could even go look some of these up. I'm sure they're in the back of the book, in the back of the textbook in a glossary. Or I could look them up in an index to go look about what does preferred dividends mean, and go look that up. I can go do some more pre-work if I want to, but what I have right now I think is good because it's setting me up to, when I go to class, I already have an idea about the topic. I have an idea about what questions I need to ask. I have questions I need to get answered. And so now I'm focused. I'm focused with my listening. When the professor is going over the formula, I'm like, yeah. I've already got the formula in my notes, right? So, in that case, I'm not trying to write it down. I'm focusing more on what he's saying about the formula. And then, if he doesn't explain it, I'm going to raise my hand. I'm going to say, Professor, I know in the formula you subtract the preferred dividends, but I don't know why. Now I have a focus for what I'm trying to get out of that lecture. When I go to the professor's lecture in the next class, I'm trying to figure out, okay, when I get done with this class, I want to know why you subtract preferred dividends. Like why? Not just that you do, but why. I want to get this clarified about earnings per share. Does it have to be reported on the face of the income statement, or is it optional and it can just be put in the notes? I want to ask this question about non-controlling interest, and is it something that I need to worry about, for exam purposes or homework purposes or project purposes or anything like that in the class, because it looks in the textbook like it's something extra. And so I just want to know, do I need to take the time to work on that? So you see what I'm doing here now. I'm not going into the next class not knowing what we're covering, trying to write down everything the professor says, not really being sure what's important, what's not important, not really being sure what's in the text and what's not in the text. I'm just trying to hang on and write down as fast as I can. Now, instead, I'm focused. I'm going into class with an objective. This is what I want to get out of this class. This is my goal, right? And the plus side for you is when you're asking these kinds of questions in class, it's showing the professor that you're serious about learning this material. It's showing the professor that you're engaging with the material early. It's showing the professor that you want to learn and that you are asking very intelligent and insightful questions. And it's going to make you look really good in class. It's going to make you look like $1,000,000. Even if you're shy and you don't ask during class, if you wait after class and ask, or you go by during office hours, it's going to be the same impression. It's going to make you look like $1,000,000. It's going to show that you're serious, and you are serious, because serious people don't do this. People who aren't serious about learning don't do this. They don't put in this kind of effort. They're interested in putting in the bare minimum to get by so they can get on to things that they are really interested in. But I'm assuming you're interested in accounting because you're an accounting major. And as you go through your upper level accounting classes, and they're going to be difficult, pre-notes to me is so critical to success. It's probably more important than any other tip I could give you in terms of, how to study for exams, or what to study for exams, or when to study for exams, or how to take notes during class, or, working on homework, getting homework questions correct, or tips for taking exams and getting exam questions right. Those things, I'm not saying those things are unimportant, but to me, this is the most important idea when it comes to learning and being successful academically. Anyway, this video might have gone a little long. In practice, doing this would take me maybe 10 or 15 minutes tops. Longer sections might take more. The first time you do it might take longer. You'll get better and faster at it as you go. But again, I can't encourage you enough to do this. Okay? And bring your pre-notes to class. Work at it. You'll get better at your pre-note taking, and your learning in class is going to be much more focused. You're going to get much more out of it. Your notes are going to be much more organized. You're going to be confident that the content in the notes are good. And when you start studying for the exam, you're going to be studying with quality material, good notes. You're going to have the right stuff in front of you. It's just going to make you much more successful as a student. Anyway, I hope that helps. Let me know if you have questions.